Well, I'm back working on the front main and I'm cleaning the shims right now. I'm inspecting the shims right now, and some of the shims will have little lips on them as if they were misplaced a little wrong the last time that they stuck out from the caps. And there's even a little wear mark here like the crank might have touched it and mushroomed it a little bit. So any of them with little edges like that, I'm sure you can't see it, but I'm catching it with the screwdriver. So I'll take and run them on a file a little bit like this, just to make sure that there's no little lip on them. Now it's smooth, because when you put them in, because there's nothing to locate them exactly, if you move them a little bit from where they were before, it might lay over the top of that lip and affect how the shim fits. So you got to make sure there's no burrs or edges on them. So I'm going to continue to clean the shims. This shim has a little bit of one here. You can see how it catches. So I take them and just lightly with a file on the edge. There, now I can't feel an edge anymore. You maybe can see where it's brighter along the edge where I took that lip off. See, this one too, it'll actually catch. So now here the two shim stacks are. I'm going to recheck them, see that they feel okay. All the shims feel good now. One thing you'll find sometimes when you take an old engine apart, again, you probably won't be able to see it, but this is actually 3 shims. There's actually 3 shims there. And sometimes you'll find these, it's such a little bit I can't even see it, but they'll have a shim stack of multiple thin shims, and they must have them pinched tight and put just a little drop of solder on them so that they stick together, because I've seen them where you have a stack of shims and they're stuck together like that, and you can grab them and peel them apart and they'll just be attached in two spots, and that's got to be to help keep them located together during their assembly. Anyway, there's a couple here where they're stuck together, but mostly they're all individual. Now we're going to go at cleaning the crank up, or making sure the crank is clean. Anyway, there the shim stacks are ready to be installed. I said on a previous video that there's nothing to locate these shims. That's why I think those little lips came from, say a couple of them were stuck a little too far one way, and then the crankshaft could have touched against them. So you just got to line them up by hand. On most any engine I've ever seen before, the shim will go all the way around the stud or bolt to locate it. But because these caps have this step in it with the removable lower shells, this step fits over the sides of the lower shell to locate it side to side, so they can't have shims that go around the bolt to locate them. So you just have to be real careful when you put these in place to make sure they're not forward or backward too much. Now I'm going to set my shim stack in. See, if you look at these shims here, there's also a little bulge on each end, and that's the side that goes toward the crank. And the only thing I can surmise, in order for the shims to fit in, you actually touch those against the crank so they're far enough over to make sure that that lip doesn't pinch on this side, I found. So they must have those shims made with that little bulge there purposely, so there's just a little bit that touches the crank on each side, and being brass, it won't hurt the crank, but that it doesn't rub all the way along, that there's clearance to start out with. So now I'm going to put this shim stack in. So I set the shim stack in, push it against the crank, Move it all the way rearward until it touches the flange of the crank here, and then I want to move it forward until it's even with the edge of the lower bearing shell, because you can see why if it were sticking back too far off the bearing shell, then when the crank moved forward a little bit, it could wear and put those little lips like I was filing off. So those should be located now. Now I'll lay a piece of plastic gauge on it. Now I'll install the bearing shell. Down it goes. Now I'll oil the threads and the surface where the nut mates. And I've run the nuts on these threads to make sure they go freely all the way down. And I also oil the nuts. I misplaced one of the nuts. I can't find it, so I got a different one I'm putting on it just for now. I'll have to get a castle nut or find it or get another castle nut. Either that or I might just double nut it with these, I think, if I don't find it. I'll start to draw them down. This one's a lot easier with only 2 instead of 4. Now this one poses a problem is I can't get a torque wrench in there. So we're just going to pull them good and tight. Oh, that should be tight. Now I'm going to take it back off and check the plastic gauge. Loosen them back up. One at a time first. Now I'll take the cap back off. Oh. If you see, the plastic gauge is squeezed on both ends and in the middle it isn't. The middle isn't squeezed because there's a relief in the bearing shell for the oil to distribute from that oiling hole in the crankshaft. So in the center section there, it doesn't squeeze the plastic gauge. Now if you can see it, it matches a 6. Well, I took one shim out and equalized the stacks. It was like the middle main bearing. They had a different size stack on each side by like 10 thousandths. And also I turned the crank flat before I put the plastic gauge in this time so that I could get a torque wrench to torque them down. And I got them torqued down now, and now I'm going to take them off and we'll see what the plastic gauge says. Now I'll pull the cap off again. Oh. Now it seems to be showing 6 thousandths right to a T. So I think I'm going to call that good. Now I turned the crank down so I could see on both sides to make sure the shims weren't protruding past the lower bearing shell. So now I'll put the cap on, snug it down, and then turn the crank flat so that I can get a torque wrench on them. There, now with the crank turned down, I can see that everything went together good with the shims lined up. And freshly oil the threads again. And the nuts. Now I'll turn the crank flat position so that I can get a torque wrench on. Now oil the bearing some more. Now I'm going to give it 2 full rotations. One. That's 2 full times around. So the next step will be cotter pinning all of them. And you don't back off on them to cotter pin them. You just take them to the next notch. And the one where I'm missing the nut, I might just put slots in the double nut and double nut it that way, because I've looked for the nut and I can't seem to find it. So I think that's it for today.